Hi, everyone. I'm Judy, the YouTube lawyer. Today, we have a special guest today who is Ruth Markel, law professor Dan Markel's mother. And she is coming in to us from Canada, Toronto, Canada. And just to give you guys a little bit of background information about Ruth Markel, she is a noted author, public speaker, and the president of R&M Enterprises, a leading management consulting firm. She's worked in senior management positions in both private and public sectors for the past 40 years. She has also lectured on issues concerning negotiation and advancement in organizations at the University of Toronto, the London Business School, and Toronto Metropolitan University, which is formerly Ryerson University. So she has made several TV and radio appearances and published 9 other books in addition to her upcoming book called The Unveiling. So let's welcome Ms. Ruth Markel to the show. Thank you, Ruth, for being here.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's really a pleasure to talk to you. I've seen you on some of the other programs, and it's great to be here.
Okay, well, it's wonderful, especially after reading so much about your son and how accomplished he was. I'm sure our viewers are looking forward to hearing more information since you are his mother. So can we start out by talking a bit about your family and personal background?
Sure.
Okay, and where are your ancestors from and how did they wind up in Canada?
Well, that's a big story. First of all, I'm living in Toronto now. Danny and our family, we all lived in Montreal until Danny was about 5 years old, and then we moved to Toronto. My ancestors are, I'm born in Montreal. My ancestors are actually from Lithuania, not far actually from the Ukraine now with the circumstances. And my parents came over in about 1930, and that was a very difficult period at the time in Europe. So many families, Jewish families in particular, send over either 1 or 2 of their children to avoid any really persecution in Eastern Europe. And my parents came over, they came over before the Holocaust, but really unfortunately, my grandparents on both sides never left Europe, and they were killed. And it's not an uncommon story, you know, in Jewish family life. So that's sort of, we have Eastern European origins. And then of course, we're all Canadian born, and the children and all the others are basically Canadian born, except Danny's children who were American born.
Mm-hmm. I see. And how old were your parents when they left to come to Canada?
They were very young. My mother was only 15, and she came and she lived with an elderly aunt. And I believe my father was more like 18 or 19 because he finished, there's high school in Europe, which is preparatory to, you know, to university. And he finished all of that and then came here and actually went to university in Montreal at McGill.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and why Canada? Do you know why or how they wound up?
Well, my mother's story actually is easier. She had an older sibling, 2 actually, who actually were in Canada, and the aunt that she stayed with was very established. So they really had a lot of living relatives here, which is, you know, a common immigration story, right? The children leave Europe in these circumstances and difficult times, and you go to whatever countries the base of the family is. So that was really the major reason.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and with your father, how did he choose Canada as opposed to the United States or some other place?
He only had relatives. See, my father's story is actually quite interesting. His father came over in about probably 1898, and he brought over all his brothers and sisters, and he didn't like it. So he decided he was going back to Europe, but the whole family came here. And we had a lot of, I didn't have grandparents, but I had really a lot of great grand aunts and uncles. It was a very large family at the time. So it's pretty much the same idea. There were a lot of roots in Canada, particularly in Montreal. And that's how we got here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's very interesting. You could write a total separate book just about that, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sure there is a lot of stuff. Actually, there's CNN is doing a very big show this coming Sunday, which relates to this issue, which is on anti-Semitism. So this is
Mhm.
was the factors that were driving many immigrants out of Europe at the time.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for telling us about that. And then, so did you grow up in Toronto?
No, Montreal. I came,
Oh,
I
Montreal.
came,
Oh, yes, that's right.
I came to Toronto when Danny was 5 and Shelley was 8. Shelley had already started school and Danny started in Toronto.
Oh, I see. And can you tell us a little bit about your educational background also?
Sure. I went to McGill University. I have a master's degree in social work, which I got in the 60s. Now you're going to get on my famous age here. And I practiced. I started out in clinical social work, but I was quite entrepreneurial and quite interested in much more in sort of management, resources. Nobody in the 60s wanted to have anything to do with organizational life and so forth. So I shot up the ladder. I was 29 years old, and I was very, very senior in my position in Quebec. And I was getting involved in very, very heavy duty, buying mainframes and computers. Now I didn't have any technical background. And then we decided we would move to Toronto, and I went for an MBA. I did, I'm now a mature student. I have 2 children, but I decided to go back full time. And so I did that in the 70s, which was also very unusual for women to be in the program, and especially women who didn't have a engineering background. And we're talking about a really different time period. So, but I did want to do the first year, which was all the technical courses, technical meaning finance, accounting, operations management, anything to do with work existence that I did not have the background in. And it served me very, very well. I formed my own corporation after. I had a management consulting firm, and I did all of the reorganizations in hospital and healthcare, many of the biggest projects in Toronto. And I even went back to Quebec, to Montreal, because they didn't fill my position right away. So I had a very, very good career, and it was quite an exciting career.
Yes, how interesting. So, this getting to Dan though, were you working also while you were raising your children?
Yes. So here's the next story.
Mhm.
I did take off. We have very good maternity benefits in Canada. Some of your audience will cringe when they hear our benefits, which are today a year off for any child that you have. And when Danny was born, not when Shelley was born, they hadn't really started. When Danny was born, I had 6 months off, and I was able to take a 6-month leave. So in essence, I had a year off, but I had always wanted to work. My mother had to work. So my mother was a widow at 38 years old, and she worked. And so for me, it was very natural to work, to go to grad school and so forth. But I did work pretty much full time, and then much later on, probably more than full time, because I had a big company to organize, and it was good.
Mhm. Oh, okay, great. Well, can you tell us more about your son Danny's childhood and his personality?
So I always say this, a lot of people are going to be very surprised. So Danny was Dennis the Menace when he was younger. He was not serious. He didn't have a serious bone in him. He was a preschooler who loved a stepladder, a mop, and anything to do with sort of big items that he could move around and have. He didn't really get serious at all until he was about 8 or 9 years old. So when people would come in, I had a wallpaper person come in when we moved from one place to the other, and Danny had peeled off all of the wallpaper. And he says to me at the time, "Mrs. Markel, this is not a boy for wallpaper, but I want to tell you that my son was like this, and he's in med school." And I said later on, as I met people when they had one of these really wild kids, I said, "Well, guess what? My son was like this too, but he went to Harvard." So that was the sort of in essence. But his early childhood, he was really, really, really quite rambunctious. He loved comics though. So that was really the stage for him to really, really read a lot. And that's how that part of it started.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yes. And what was his relationship like with his sister? I assume Shelley is at least a couple of years older than him.
She is. She's 3 years older, and he respected her. He loved being, I think, the younger brother, and she really she really sort of I don't want to say she took care of him as in care, but she would say she did his shoelaces. She had extra responsibilities. But they had the 3-year difference was quite substantial in the sense that when Danny was young, she was already in nursery school. We have different things we call things today in terms of the schooling. And so she was out of the house most of the mornings when he was very, very young. And he was very excited for her to come home. Shelley, he kept on calling out the window and waiting for her to come. And really I would say that was in essence his whole life, like where she took the serious responsibility of, when we traveled or different things, she had to close the lights. She knew what to do. And Danny was very, very good at it, but he didn't take it on until he was much older.
Mm-hmm. I see. Was he always a good student?
Well, it's a funny answer. He was a very good student when he was older. When he was younger, he was a good student. He had the highest marks in grade 3 that they did an aptitude test in his school. And they called me in actually. Why is he only getting an A or an A minus? This is sort of, so I said he needs another year to simmer down. I would say it in about 10, when he was 10, he really just, shot up the ladder. He was like way, way better in his language development, his problem solving, his curiosity, like everything about him just really, really gelled as he just got that little maturity more. But he was a good student. He almost had, I would say, close to a photographic memory. So I don't know if you played ever with trivia. Do you remember the game's Trivia Pursuit?
Oh yeah.
He practically memorized every card, and he would beat all the kids, at his at any kind of games when they played. And he was fortunate, and he had very, very good talent in writing. So he didn't have to work. He didn't work hard in school until law school, to be honest. I used to tease him. You don't get to the Olympics, and there's a little bit of practice, not just talent. But he was fortunate, really. His writing was excellent in terms of academic writing, but daily writing. Like he could write for the USA Today, which he did do, and had a full range of writing skills, which helped him.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what kind of schools did he go to when he was a child? Did he go to private schools?
Yes, he went to private schools. And then afterwards, in grade 10, he went to a public school in Toronto. And he knew he wanted, so his choice of schools is really important. He only wanted, I should say, from the time he was about 11 or 12, he knew he wanted only go to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale. So this was like his choice, and he already had planned it. But what was really significant at that time, first of all, it was much harder for a Canadian student to get into the American universities. Plus, there were no scholarships for undergrad in the earlier parts from Canada, coming from Canada. And he knew exactly what he had to do. So as soon as he was in high school, he really, really planned he became editor of the newspaper. He got the newspaper running again. It was quiet or dead, if you want to call it, for 5-6 years. He got an environmental project going. He was on the debating team. He knew, and Harvard had told us when we first got there as parents in first year and freshmen, they said, we know all the kids are going to have the marks. It's really the leadership stuff that you need. And what was amazing is there was no internet there then, I should say. So he just knew what he needed to do to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. But how did you and his father feel about him wanting to go to the United States and go off to Harvard?
We knew it was going to happen. What was the only thing that there was only one concern? It was he hadn't really apply to any Canadian universities. So one day Phil said, just as he was, really getting down to the final application, says, I think you need a backup plan. Do me a favor, just apply to one place in Canada. And he did. He sort of appeased him, and he did what he was really successful in getting where he wanted to go. We went, when a young child says something to you, like they want to go to Harvard or Princeton or one of these places, if there's some realism, but if you don't want them to go, or you can't afford it, or there's other issues, you don't let it sort of rise as much. So he had a whole, he had a plan, he had expectations, and we never quelched it. So we expected him to go. And truthfully, he left very young. He left by 18, and he never came back to Canada really to live permanently. So his whole life was, American.
I see. And yeah, so after he went off to Harvard, then it sounds like he also lived in the United Kingdom, right, to get his master's degree. And
well, he went, so
Israel.
he finished, so he would have stayed in university his whole life, right? This was the point. So after he finished Harvard undergrad, he went for one year in Israel for a fellowship, and then he went to Cambridge, England, and he did get another master's degree. And then he came back to Harvard Law School in Boston, and he stayed there, and he finished, and then he clerked, and then he worked in Washington.
Yes, and then
So
he wound up in Tallahassee of all places. Yeah.
Well, you know what? He wanted to be an academic. When he was working in Washington, he would always say that at one point that he wanted to be a dean of a university, of a law school, which would have been, 10 or 15 years down the road. But he was very, very flexible. Dan, he lived in New York, he lived in Boston, he lived in London, England, he lived in Arizona. He worked because of the clerking in San Francisco. He made friends all over the world, and he stayed connected with them. That was his major sort of skill and life skill, really. And he always called them, and he had, a whole community of friends. So he kind of was very flexible to be anywhere.
I see. Yes, I remember, I think his friend Jason Solomon basically said that too, that Dan was the great connector. He made friends everywhere he went. He put people in touch with each other. He kept in touch with everybody. So, but then how often did you see him though, especially after he moved to Florida?
We saw him frequently because he was Danny's, just this whole point, we're talking about staying connected. He loved the community. He loved coming back to Canada. So right now I'm in what we would call our vacation home, which in the wintertime has skiing, and in the summertime has, leisure activities, recreational activities, tennis and swimming and so forth. And he would come back every year for a month. Because don't forget, as he was, moving towards academia, there was more flexibility in the summertime. And he came back for all of the Jewish holidays, particularly Passover, where he came to Montreal, because we had a large family there still. And then we would go visit him. So we saw him a lot. And then we also went to New York. He was frequently, let's say if he was working in New York, we visited him in New York. And he would come from New York to Montreal or Toronto. We saw him a lot. It was not what you would call the typical American, come see your family on Thanksgiving. So it was very much more visiting. I would say in that respect, he had still a very kind of Canadian sort of value system of coming home and seeing everybody all the time, frequently.
Oh, that's great. Well, did he also bring his children on these visits, or?
Yes.
More just him?
Always. The only thing where he changed, so as the point of having the children, he didn't like snow anymore, Dan. He used to tease him. I used to say, come and let your children experience winter. And that was no more in the cards. He got very used to warm climates, which Tallahassee in the summertime doesn't get hotter. He lived in Arizona, he lived in Israel. And I used to say, how do you manage it? It's 110, outside. He says, well, it's okay. And if, with the children, he would take them at 6 o'clock in the morning in Tallahassee to the park. So he really worked around both, you call it the climate, the temperature, and his lifestyle.
I see. Yes. And can you tell us also a little bit more about what he was like as a father to his children?
I think of all, as we are talking earlier on, he had tremendous academic achievements. He had tremendous publishing sort of success. To me, the greatest thing about Dan was his how he was as a father. And he loved the kids, and he was very, I think because he still had such a strong child in him, really. Trader Joe's came to Tallahassee, I'll give you an example, and they just opened up there. And I don't think the boys were older than 4 and 3, if that. And he let them go free in the grocery store towards the cereal boxes so that they could have, all these new choices. And it was hysterical. In fact, I figured every box is going to be on the floor within 2 minutes, but they were a little more disciplined than he was. But he loved the kids. And also he put up their paintings across his living room. He took an old fashioned, if you remember when you would hang up laundry, and most people can't even remember that because everybody had to dry it, but an old fashioned rope, and he would hang their pictures from the center of the room. And one time I teased him and I said, I think you have a new decoration here. It's called preschool decor, because you would just walk in and everything was there. And in addition, if his kids were listening to one of their songs in the car, you couldn't talk. There was no adult conversation. So the children were really his. He was on a pedestal as a father, as far as I'm concerned, but they were definitely treated royally from the attention and the love that he gave them.
Yes, I think I also heard that he would often show pictures of his kids to his students or flash them up on the big screen. So the students had to know what was going on with his children first before the class began. So
I'm sure that's true. And the truth is he was a little bit very overactive, maybe on Facebook. Don't forget, Facebook just came out at that time. And if they were in the park, there were at least like 50 pictures, following the visit. So he was a fan of social media also. He started Prof's blog. So the sort of his interest in the whole issue of availability of social media was very much a part of his personal life at a great length, and also his professional life as well.
Yes. And so I showed you some of those comments or proposed questions from some of my subscribers, and one of them wanted to know more memories that you have of Dan that maybe hasn't been told to the public yet. So is there any other, like, very important memory that you would like to share with people about him?
Well, I have really very beautiful memories of him. I mean, the strongest memories are of a different kind. They're really the things that I try to express that nobody can imagine, which is his early childhood. When he would wander off. Once we went to, I wasn't actually with him, was preschool, 5 years old. He went with Phil and Shelley to the mall, and he hid, in a picture like Macy's, a big department store, and he hid in one of these shirt racks that you can put your body through, and Phil couldn't find him. But because he was drilled, I knew I was in a new city. He was only there for 2 weeks in Toronto from Montreal. He was 5. I drilled him on the phone number, a new number. And he went to a candy kiosk, and he said to the lady, he said, I need to call my mother, I'm lost. So he called me, and I said, where are you? So he told me, I'm in the candy kiosk. So I went and I got him, but by the time, Phil, I think, had a heart attack by that point because he couldn't find him. And then we had to go back and search him. So these are the memories. They're very unique memories, and they're very particular to Dan. When he was a little older, he was 10, and he was into books and reading. I had to take him to a sleuth store. So this is for detectives only. So he kept me busy with his different initiatives. This was what is on my mind now. Let's go do it. That kind of thing. So he was different, but he was fun. He was not had such an easy temperament. With all his activity, he was very, very easy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and is it true? I thought I heard somewhere that people gave him stocks for his bar mitzvah.
That's
I guess
true.
because he liked stock trading.
That's true, because people think of him as this academic lawyer. So when he had different careers. When he was about 12 or 13, he actually wanted to be a rabbi because he always liked the Jewish tradition, and he was more, observant. It was a very important part of his life. And at the same period, about a year later, he got very interested. It actually came a little bit at the same time that he didn't go to summer camp one year, and he was on one of these programs in Cambridge, England, where he learned finance. He must have been already 15 years old. And he came back, and he had very, very strong interest in the stock market, but this had been going on for a few years. And he did that. And then, he got interested in writing, and then he got interested in law. So he had phases, right? He traveled through life, and he had traveled through interests of different nature.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you also called him Bozo for quite a number of years.
That is true. He was Danny. It was Danny when he lived in Montreal and Toronto until he was 17, 18. And then when he went to Harvard, he was Dan. Okay, so this was his name. He shortened it. But his nickname from when he was younger, because I told you what he was a character, was Bozo. But he would call my office and say Bozo called, but he wouldn't say Danny anymore. That was where he was quite unique.
Okay, well, that's quite funny. Yeah. Well, just moving on, since of course we also want to cover your book and tell everybody out there that the book is available for pre-order at Amazon.com. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write your new book?
Yes, I certainly could. Well, this is the sadder part of our whole story, as you know. We looked at the tragedy, and as the tragedy unfolded more, at the very, very beginning, I'll start at the beginning. I started to keep, I would call a record, not a diary, a record of all of the different things that were happening to us. It was more like a chronological event sort of record. And I wrote books before, I think you know this. So this is my 10th book. So I already was in the habit of kind of looking at things and throwing them, thinking about a book early, but not the book that I ended up writing. So the book is called The Unveiling. It's a mother's reflection on murder, grief, and the trial life. And the reason I called it The Unveiling is twofold. The unveiling in the Jewish religion is a ritual that happens. The person is buried, and you can have a ritual of when the tombstone is put on the graveside, you have an inscription on the tombstone. And after that, they keep the tombstone writing hidden with a cloth. And the cloth is there until there's an actual service of where people get together and they have a religious service of lifting the cloth, and it's called an unveiling. Now, why I chose that title first from a personal reason was, prior to that, I was sad, I was in a daze, I was in shock. But when the unveiling happened, I really started a grief tragedy, the whole journey of being in deep, serious grief. And it's a little bit, like the expression, the nail in the coffin, which really did it for me. And so that is one reason that I chose the title, which really talks about the book and the grief. And the grief is the first big part of the book. The second part is, and the most important part for the public, is that this is a sensational case. I think you can know that. There's been a lot of media. It's been 2020, NBC, and a phenomenal series with the podcasts and so forth, and all your interest now and so forth. So there's high interest, but the point is really behind this sensational interest and so forth, there's a family who's suffering. And the whole point of the book called The Unveiling is to show to the public what it feels like to be a victim, what it feels like to go through the trials, what it feels like to learn about a murder, which is terrible, what does it feel like to see the perpetrators in front of you in the room? And so the book really exposes the reality of the tough victim experience, because everybody else is distracted with the criminal story, with the other aspects. And here we have a lot of people involved. It's a conspirator case and so forth. So the idea here is to really show the victim experience. And right now, as you know, the shootings in the States, this is not, we're not by far the only people whose lives have been shattered. There's so much suffering from the pandemic. 1 million people have died. So there's a lot of loss going on. And the idea really is to show that, you experience the grief, experience the loss. And then another part of it is to have the courage to redefine yourself, okay, which is one of the things that we did with the grandparent legislation. We were very successful to get, a big piece of legislation passed in Florida. And that's what I worked on. So my story is from grief, to advocacy, to promise, and to outcome. And there's a message there for many, many victims to, don't get yourself lost in the loss. It's going to take you a long time, and there's no rush to get out of the loss. And even if you have a successful outcome like we did, you're still going to feel the grief. One of the groups that I really, people ask me, who influences you? I think Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Okay, when you think about what they have achieved, now they're doing drugs, right? What they have achieved is just phenomenal, and that's sort of where I want to be. That's where I want to talk about the book, in the sense for the victim can find a new life, and it doesn't mean you're losing anything else, because the grief is not going anywhere, and that is the purpose of what the book is about. And I hope your readers will go and get the book and order the book.
Yes, exactly. Do you know what date it's actually going to be out?
Yeah, it's getting closer, September 20th.
Okay,
so
great.
It can be pre-ordered now on Amazon. It's really around the corner now.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. I already pre-ordered it weeks ago.
Oh, so, thank you so much. That's so wonderful.
Yeah. So how about the process of writing the book? Did you do it all by yourself, or did Dan's father or your daughter help you write it?
No. It was a solo project in that sense. I did have some initial help. Remember now, so I'm writing as a way of probably coping and filling a void. And then I had the pandemic. So I would find another project if it wasn't the pandemic. But the pandemic in Canada, we were much stricter than the States earlier. So like you're really in a lockdown environments. And so I had that quiet, which I needed to write the first part, believe me, environment. But the point is, I had some help. So there's a formality of presenting a proposal that goes, through the agent to a publisher. And it was in the first phase, nothing to do with the book writing, but the initial. I did have somebody who worked with me, and that was very good. And then I was really hoping later on that I would use other resources, because it's a tough story to write, to be more interviewed and so forth. And then I really just started writing, and it was hard. The first 3 months, it's a very hard thing to do, because you're writing, every time you dig up old wounds, you're, really, really starting to face the sadness and the scars and so forth. So the initial phase is very, very tough, but I did it on my own. I had, good editorial help along the way here and there, and I had other people who knew the case well, and I would, have them check it in, because there's detail. And the second part of the book is all about the trial life. So I wanted to make sure there was accuracy, or enough accuracy in that section.
I see. Yes. And in terms of promoting your book, are you going around to different bookstores or going places in person to promote your book, or is it mostly done through Zoom or other?
No, it's done both. The publisher, excuse me for a minute. publisher has a publicist that does, some of the main, and then now we are definitely developing, some of our own marketing, some of our own initiatives. Another issue is that it's going to get a lot of attention in the States, and I do want it to be in bookstores here as well. So in Canada. So it's a whole combination of anybody can help, anybody can buy a book, and anybody can market the book. And if there's a bookstore, we'll listen, and we get it there, or a program to promote it. But it's exciting. It's very exciting.
Yes. And since your son had so many connections to different cities, can you imagine, like, if you could go to Cambridge, Boston area bookstores, to do readings, or go down to Florida, do book readings there, or
I hope so. I mean, I hope that's the going to happen, and we have some invitations already, and sure. And then there's also there are the salespeople from Simon & Schuster. So it's Post Hill Press who actually are the publishers, but Simon & Schuster sales force, let's call it, do the distribution.
Okay, wow, that's great. Yeah. Let's see. So would you like to we'll switch gears again, because you did want to share some advice from your experiences being involved in the criminal justice system, and share advice to people who are also victims of crime. For example, how were you treated by the prosecutors or the investigators?
We were treated, there's different phases. So in the investigation, nothing happened in the case for about 2 years, all right? So we worked with law enforcement alone. There's no prosecutors for about 2 years. We worked with the Tallahassee Police Department, with Craig Isom. We worked very closely with Pat Sanford. These are also witnesses, right, at the trials, and from the FBI. And they were the major, contacts with us. And also the Tallahassee Police Department has a victim liaison, which is the person who sort of works with the family and sort of keeps the family, up to date on any new issues or so forth. But till the first year, when there was a major press conference, anybody who's done their history on this knows, that was when it was announced that they were going to be looking for a Prius, right? So that was, the first period was really quiet, and it's hard because you're in a period of uncertainty as it is, but when there was nothing happening, and we went, from nothing to sort of the arrests happen, and the whole shift occurs. So at the time when the arrests started, the Tallahassee Police Department said that soon we'll be transitioning to working with the prosecutors. It's like somebody's taking care of you. I don't mean this in a bad way, in a positive way. So the victim has, like somebody looking out for you in a kind of, let's call it, I don't want to use the word parental, but to somewhat you're so vulnerable, it is maybe parental. So the TPD is, your first cushion. And then we were transferred to the prosecutor's office, who also has a separate victim liaison person, who then became our contact, and so forth. So we had, very, very nice support from the law enforcement and the transition to the prosecutor's office.
I see. And did you have to make multiple trips, throughout this whole process in the last, let's see, boy, I guess the arrest happened more than 6 years ago, right? So
Right.
Have you had to make tons of trips down?
We didn't come to all the hearings, but there were several trips that we did make, which were in addition to, let's call it, what you see at the trials. We had some meetings on some occasions, and then attending the trials we had at the very, very beginning. University, the law school, did a fantastic memorial for Dan. We had the terrible job, though. There's another side of all this, right? We had to clean out Dan's house. I mean, this is like, there's trauma. You have the trauma of the murder, but you have the trauma of being responsible to clean out your adult son's home. And that is really tough. So we had to come back for a few things, and we did come back. And then after that, there were definitely the trials and postponements. If anybody followed this, there was about 5 or 6 times that there was continuances, and so you're really living in a roller coaster lifestyle for several years.
I see. Yes. And were you there the whole time for both trials?
Yes, we were. We were there the full 3 weeks the first time, and just now in May for the full 2 weeks.
Oh, I see. Yes. Was it very stressful or physically exhausting also, just to be sitting there nonstop?
The first trial was much harder than the second one, because the first trial, I mean, you can't imagine what it feels like when you see the people who have murdered your child, your son, to me, still my baby, right? And they're in the room, and you have to, confront that. And then you have also the witnesses, where you want to make sure, like, somebody who's a witness is credible and so forth. So that the first one was much harder, and Garcia's trial was a little simpler in only one way, that the evidence appeared cleaner to making the jurors having a judgment about it. Like as you know, Catherine's first trial was a mistrial, and that was difficult too. That was because we didn't, have the idea and preparation, for a mistrial. So that was hard. The first one was a much more difficult experience. The second trial now was not as difficult for many reasons. One, we had heard some of the evidence before, and you sort of acclimatize. I don't acclimatize to 2 or 3 things, which is I never stay in the room, and others might. As soon as they start at the beginning, from the autopsy report, the medical examiner report, it's almost a half a day. And in both trials, I don't stay in the room. It's just too painful. So those are, within the trial itself, there's some very, very, difficult moments. It's not easy. This is not for sissies. This is really a hard job.
I see. Yes. And so was your role there mainly to give the victim impact statement, or were there other things behind the scenes that you were doing during the trial?
No, we're active. There's a very interesting piece of legislation. It's called Marcy's Law, MARSY' law. It's a law for victims. It's a victim's bill of rights. It started out in California, and this is also it was a very famous case too, maybe not as much known as ours, where the boyfriend, I think, killed the sister of a very successful corporate executive who had a lot of funds to start a victim's whole legislation, which was, right across, and they're not finished. It went to many states, but Florida adopted Marcy's Law in 2019. So there are a lot of other rights for victims, not just what you see in the victim impact statement. There's, periods of time where you are not asked to approve the plan, but you are consulted. And there's a serious amounts of communications between the family and the prosecutors. And that goes on. I don't want to call it behind the scenes. It's just that it's not a public thing. It's either prior to the trials, after the trials, during the trials. There could be, situations where there's and it's good that there is, a consultation with the family.
Yes. And what was the experience like when you had to get up there on the stand and read your impact statement? Were you nervous, or had you rehearsed?
No, I actually, for me, the harder part of that was before. So the similar to this experience, there's some trauma situations that happen in very specific moments. So what the purpose of the book, I said before, was the unveiling, which was a Jewish ritual, writing the victim statement, which we did prior to the 2019 trial it was written maybe more like 2017. As I mentioned before, there were many, many, many continuances along the way. There was COVID and there was other circumstances where Georgia wanted to try both Garcia and Catherine together. So I wrote the first victim impact statement, the one that I actually really used in the end, about 2 years before I used it. But that was hard. It was, for me, the delivery itself was, I wouldn't call it traumatic. It was much more difficult to write this because you're scooping out, all the old wounds when you're writing it, talking about Dan's death, talking about your life is yanked away from you, all of the shattering aspects of it. So the writing itself and the period of going backwards was the most difficult for me, much more than going up on the stand.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yes. And did you want to also speak this last time at Katie McBanua's second trial, or did you kind of decide with your daughter that she would be the one speaking?
Well, we all wrote them. When we prepared the very first time, I mean, Phil wrote a victim impact statement, Shelley wrote one, I wrote one, and over 35 families and friends, family members and friends wrote victim impact statements, which the judge, both times, it's part of sentencing. You give it to the judge to read, so he knows about the case. So they did it also, and I certainly the first time was more than ready to do it because it sort of also wanted to get it off my chest. The expression already, I was so involved in it emotionally. And this time Shelley did it. And I'm sure we still have, unfortunately, looks like we have a few more trials and so forth. So there'll be other members to do their part if they want to.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. Yes. And were there any other family members that also showed up to any of the trials besides
yes,
you?
There were, yes. My brother-in-law, there was a lot of friends, some close family friends. Shelley had a friend, and there were people there. And to the first trial. This particular trial, we actually didn't sort of suggest too much to have, but we do know a lot of people. So that, just to go back a little bit, because Danny lived in Tallahassee, we have a lot of friends there and friends of Dan's really who are now tremendous support to us. So they come to the trials, or we go out to dinner afterwards, or sometimes we go to their personal homes. A few times the trial fell in the Jewish holidays, so we even went to synagogue in Tallahassee. So it's not like you're so isolated, because I'm sure if Danny had not lived there and we had not had so many previous visits, it would be much tougher.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's great that you still had the support of other people who actually lived there in Tallahassee to help you out. Yes.
Yeah, they've been excellent, really, the Tallahassee support, and Danny's friends all around, and our friends. We all have our own networks who keep up and say, did you see this? Did you read that? Besides we read the documents too. So it's a busy behind the scenes lifestyle.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's so wonderful that there are a lot of other people out there. Maybe you don't even know who they are, other friends of Dan who, are hoping to help or reach out to you too. Yes, getting to some of the comments from the other subscribers, there was one person who wanted to know how your faith offers you strength. And she also wanted to let you know that your whole family is in her prayers. And then there was another person who asked, can you share some words of wisdom or coping skills on how you dealt with the loss of your loved ones or loved one?
Yes, so the idea of faith is important. We have different practices in our faith. Some of them are observances related to the Sabbath, which is the Saturday. Some of them are related to kosher food, and we have a lot of rituals related to mourning. And I would say I probably will do most of those in the most observant way, which means, and part of that is visits to the cemetery. So I just back up a little bit. I personally get, and this relates to the second part of the question, where do you find solace? Like where is the moments that you yourself find the quiet period or the thing that works best for you. So I basically do go to the cemetery fairly frequently. The cemetery where Danny is actually it's an amazing, a beautiful place. Like in Montreal, it's a really old-fashioned cemetery where my parents are buried, and the sort of graves are one on top of each other. There's very little, places to walk. Where Danny is, it's a much more a beautiful site, and he happens to be buried on the outside. And people have put benches along the cemetery, so if you want to have a moment of solitude, you can really have it. And so for me, that's how I get my best, emotional, personal support and so forth. And I do observe. So the traditions of our faith are once a year, it's called the Yortzeit. That's the anniversary of the death of the person, which was just for Danny right now in July 19th. This is the first time actually where the English date coincided with the Jewish start. So July 19th in the evening was the beginning of the memorial part of the Jewish religion for Danny, which was the 20th. And so that's part of one of the things that I do. We also have special memorial prayers, which we do 4 times a year in relationship to, that's called Yisker. It's another special time of services related to all the issues related to mourning and, and annual practices. So I would say that's where I have my faith more so. Other people might go to synagogue, like you go to church on a very regular basis. I probably do that less in proportion to, some of the other activities or events that, pertain to practice. In terms of advice for other families, I say take your time. And this is an important message, take your time when you want to think about doing something, for the other person. Similarly, we just did the grandparent legislation. I think that's a very big thing. Many families want to do a foundation. They want to have an annual fundraiser. They want to do so many things. And it takes them a long time till they sort of mobilize themselves. And I say, take as much time as you need to do those activities, but then try. And this is a try. This is not do. Because I could say do something and there's no do in grief. But then I have an expression now, which is try not to get lost in the loss. So lost, L-O-S-T, in the loss. You see what I'm saying? The L-O-S-S part of it. And if there's any way, that you have the courage and create the courage to try to help yourself, because you have to redefine yourself. It takes time and whatever supports you need. And I say, take everything that works for you, whether it's meditation, whether it's sleep. A lot of people have sleep disturbances, PTSD. I mean, you can name the whole list, right? And really just, use whatever you need and take whatever you need and give. And also gratitude. I'm very, very grateful. We've had phenomenal support along the years, all kinds of support. From experts, lawyers, friends. There's not a bit of things that haven't contributed to what I say to keep us standing. So that's a very nice part of it as well.
Mm-hmm. I see. Oh, well, I hear your phone ringing, so we have a couple of minutes left.
Yeah,
Would you like to?
The phone is fine. It'll go off in 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, would you like to just touch briefly more about the Grandparents Act and your relationship with your grandchildren, Dan's children?
Sure. The grandchildren, what happened was we were visiting the grandchildren for the first 2 years after the murder. And then after the arrests came, we were cut off. And we tried to work behind the scenes. We had our lawyers working, and to try to make any kinds of arrangements and so forth. And really nothing was happening. And in that first part of the period, which is 2016, 2017, we have very good lawyers in New York who are always with us. And one of them said to me, you're going to have to write a bill. I need to write a bill in Florida. I'm sitting in Toronto. So, and that was totally fresh in my mind, like in other words, and I wasn't ready yet. It was really like early, like I was telling you before, when other people are thinking about what they can do or they can't do, and so forth, that I let it sink. I never cut it out of my mind. And then as time progressed, other friends, American friends, started, you're going to need to have a lobbyist. So again, a lobbyist, I'm not sure what to do and how to work it, because we have a different parliamentary system altogether than you do, and so on. But I listened, and then I did contact one lobbyist, and that was a time. It was funny when it happened. It was in like 2018 when there was big change in the elections in the States. So that part didn't happen. She said, wait. And then what happened was, after Garcia's trial, this is a funny story. The weekend after his trial, it was my birthday. I was in Tallahassee, and I went to the hairdresser, and this young woman comes over to me, and she says, "Can I give you a hug?" And I said, "Sure," because I could see by age that she was probably one of Danny's friends. And her name is Karen Halpern Cyphers, who is quite known in Tallahassee. And she says, "What can I do for you?" I said, and it just blurted out. Now, Garcia had just been convicted, I should say. This is the weekend before the death penalty part and the trial. And I said, grandparent alienation. And it just came out because I've been sitting now for 3 years on it. And she says, "Dan." And I said, "Wow, Dan, we were, like that was too exciting to be happening." But what was amazing, this was all in October 2019. And in January 2020, actually Senator Brandeis had put through the Senate a preliminary bill on grandparent visitation. It didn't go through in 2020. It didn't go through in 2021 for different reasons. But in 2022, it really happened. And in both the legislature, it was, I think, 100-3 who passed it, and the Senate was unanimous. But the bill's wording, so this is really important too. Like, it's not just to say you're writing a bill, but the bill's wording was very, very specific to allow grandparents visitation in circumstances where there could be a civil or a criminal suit against the natural parent. And what's really amazing, so the bill passed, DeSantis passed it in June. And the other day, unbeknownst to me, I was just looking through some messenger requests, and since we have the bill passed, I mean, this is totally new. You're the first one to hear about it. I have requests now asking us what should we do? We need to know how to get access to the bill. So this is like really, it's an amazing experience. It helps really, it doesn't change the grief, but what it really does do, it gives you and families and others, and that's why I keep on saying to do what you want to think you want to do. It gives you the courage to fight the trauma. And that, I think, is what the bill did, certainly for us. And this outcome, which is not really for our benefit at all yet, it's available now to many, many people living in Florida. So that's the most exciting thing I can honestly say that's come out of this whole difficult murder story.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, well, there were some commenters in the past who were asking, "Oh, so this is great. Now they get to see their grandkids," but it doesn't actually apply to your situation.
Not yet, no. It has to be, so the way the bill reads is there has to be the one parent who's deceased, and in this circumstances, and then the other person has to be charged with criminal or civil suit, and maybe convicted, but the charge is enough to start a process of, going to a judge and so forth. But we're not there. No, we haven't done either. And so there's just, opportunities to use still other voluntary, times to get some access.
Yes. And you said in a previous interview that you were able to see your grandchildren for less than a day back in April, right? Before Charlie Adelson was arrested. Yeah.
Correct. So what happened was, and so we, if you remember, because we're all working with dates, in February of 2022, Catherine McBanna was supposed to have her trial. When that was canceled or continued, I use the word canceled, but because continued to me means it should be, stop. It should be on. Yeah. But when it was postponed to May, at that point, and the grandparent legislation was getting very, very successful. So there was like a timing of two things. We did get an email from Wendi saying that she was having a bar mitzvah for her son, her oldest son, who would be turning 13 in July. And she wanted us to visit. And that was going to be for May the 14th. The new trial was May the 16th. And, so she had wanted to have maybe some contact with us just before the new trial. Anyway, and what happened was, as we were talking through email back and forth, I said, it would really be nice to have an in-person visit with both Benjamin and Lincoln, because we now have waited 6 years. We haven't seen them. They wouldn't even know who we are. If they suddenly, saw us in a general audience in a synagogue or wherever, they were little, young children. So anyway, so I asked her if we can go for ice cream on the day before, like the Friday before what would have been the bar mitzvah on the Saturday. And she said, yes. But then she wrote back, look, if you want an in-person visit, come in April. And we grabbed it. We took a plane and we left Toronto early, like 6 a.m. We went and we met both Benjamin and Lincoln after school, like, pretty close to their school ending. And we had a great, great visit. We got back on a plane to go to Toronto. The plane was 9 o'clock at night. And we both arrived in Toronto, maybe 1 a.m. or so. And then 6 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from the FBI, Charlie's arrested. So all in 24 hours, we had this major 2 breakthroughs in, one 24-hour period. So that's what we did. We saw the children. And unfortunately, we were disinvited to the bar mitzvah after the arrest. We hope that we will have more opportunities. I did ask for a Zoom call for Shelley's children. I want all my grandchildren to see what they look like, so it's very important for Shelley's children, who are big kids now. They're like, 22, 19, and 16, to see their cousins. So they all have a very, I'll call it a grown-up sort of face recognition of what the other cousins look like. And that happened also. So we're going to keep, keeping all our eyes and ears and hands open to create the opportunities, for further contact.
Mm-hmm. Well, have you been able to send cards or gifts to your grandchildren in Florida?
Yes, we have. We did all along, like all the years, but there were not any real responses. Most recently, I sent a gift for the bar mitzvah. Shelley had sent something from her family. We still have other gifts that have to be acknowledged, but we did get some certainly answers to some of the most recent gifts.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. Yes. Well, it's been almost an hour, so I'm just wondering if you have any other parting things that you would like to share with the viewers. I'm just really overwhelmed by the interest in this case, people supporting you and caring about Dan, wanting to know more details, what's going on with your family, everything like that. So I'm sure people are really going to be excited to hear from you.
I'm privileged. I want to just say we are all very privileged. I thank your whole a listening community. I say my life is 2 words: trauma and gifts. All right. So we've had a lot of trauma in all of us in our personal life, and we've had a lot of gifts. And the gifts are all of the interest, all of the media support. We didn't talk about the media too, because they've been very, very supportive. Legal support, all of Dan's community, our personal networks at home, who keep up on every detail. So this has really been a very difficult journey, but at the same time, there has been tremendous support to our family, and we are very, very grateful. And I thank you. And I thank you for having the show.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you for your time and everything. Well, why don't you stay on a little bit, but I'll go ahead and stop recording then. Okay,
Sure,
well, thank you all
sure.
for joining in today's show, and hopefully everybody will tune in later with continued live streams about the case. So thank you again, Ms. Markel.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.